This Week in IT. I look at the year in review with stories about how new features came to Microsoft Loop, the beginning of the end for Windows Server update services, a new hybrid app for Microsoft Teams, how Teams got a Slack-like makeover, and the timeline for phasing out the legacy Outlook client and replacing it with the new Outlook app. So stay tuned to find out more. Welcome to This Week in IT, the show where I talk about everything connected to Azure, Microsoft 365 and Windows. But before I get started today, I've got a quick favour to ask you. About 33% of the people who watched last week's video weren't subscribed to the channel. Now, as we go live today, we're on about 10,710 subscribers, and I'd love it if we could push that up to 10,750 this week. So if you'd like to see this kind of weekly news update from petri.com, please subscribe to the channel. And don't forget to hit the bell notification to make sure that you don't miss out on the latest uploads. So if you haven't come across Notion before, it's a note-taking and productivity app on steroids, and it's been a trendsetter in the remote work and collaboration space over the last 4 or 5 years. There are many small businesses and startups that run their entire businesses on Notion, and there's a huge ecosystem built around it, especially the template market. Now, Microsoft Loop has a very similar look and feel to Notion, and it's clearly Microsoft's answer to Notion because they had to do something to attract all of these small businesses and SMBs that are really into Notion and would prefer to use it. It was released in preview in November 2021 based on the Fluid framework, and it became generally available last year. Now, if you already have a Microsoft 365 subscription, it might seem like a no-brainer to use Loop, and it may well be. And Loop and Notion, obviously Loop is still in its infancy as a product. Notion is already a mature product, but Microsoft has done pretty well at building out Loop, but there are still pros and cons to both of these solutions. But one of the disadvantages of Loop at this stage is that it doesn't have a database feature, and that's one of the capabilities of Notion that makes it such a powerful solution. Now, Notion implements what is essentially a lightweight database feature as part of tables, and Loop also has tables, but they're not a database as they stand today. And databases can be embedded into a Loop page from other applications, but it's not the same as having a native database functionality. On the latest episode of Unplug IT, Daryl Webster interviewed Rebecca Keys, who's a program manager on the Microsoft Loop team. And as part of that interview, she revealed that Microsoft is working on adding database functionality to Loop. Now, I don't believe Microsoft has publicly said that anywhere before, and I spoke to Daryl a little bit about it during the week, and he said one of the problems is that, like most other products in the Microsoft 365 ecosystem, there's no roadmap for Loop, and apparently MVPs have been asking for that, so hopefully it's something that Microsoft will implement in the future for Loop so that we can see what features are being worked on. But in my mind, this is really big news. If Loop gets that database functionality that Notion has, then this is going to be a real game changer for Microsoft. Now, it's interesting what Microsoft is currently doing with tables in Loop, because you can see that they're gradually starting to build out what will eventually be part of the database functionality. So you can see on my screen here that I've got the show notes for this episode, and I format everything in a table. We do this together with our news director Rabia, so we collaborate on this document. Now, the filter function is something that's been added very recently to tables, and if you have a look at the table here, the icons across the top, you see we've got a new one called filter. Now, if I click on that, I can add one or more rules to determine what I'm going to be shown in this table. And here I can add one or more conditions to determine what I see in the table. So for instance, I could select the notes column, I select a condition here, so if it contains a particular piece of text, here I had to remind myself that I should credit Daryl for this news. And you can see here, this is the row where Daryl is mentioned in the text. And I can go back and add another filter if I want, make this as simple or as complicated as I like, and just clear all there. So that's a really useful new feature for filtering what you can see in a table, especially if you've got very large tables, of course. Now, another interesting thing which I stumbled across recently, and I don't know whether this has been there from the beginning or if it's something new they added, I suspect it's been added at some point, is that you can go into, well, any column in a particular row, right-click, and you've got the option to open detailed view. Now, you can actually edit this information in this row here, just like you might do in a database. And I've been using this a bit recently, actually, and it looks very, very similar to what you see in Notion, of course. So in my mind, this is another step that Microsoft is taking to build out the database functionality in tables in Loop. And filtering functionality also works with sync components like task lists or third-party integrations such as GitHub, Trello, and Jira. Now, if you've been following this channel for some time, you probably know that I'm a big Loop fan, and I occasionally go back to using OneNote because I have some legacy things in OneNote and I still add to those notebooks. But what really reminds me about how dreadful OneNote can be is the synchronization story. You don't have all of this kind of instant collaborative technology like you have in Loop and the ability to share components. And synchronization in Microsoft OneNote, to be honest, is just broken. And I would say that after Teams, Loop is the second most used application in Microsoft 365 for me personally. It's just the go-to place now where I need to take notes, if I need to collaborate on anything with somebody, unless it's something very specific that needs to go in a Word document or in an Excel spreadsheet, for instance. Loop is always the starting place for that kind of work. Now, of course, database functionality would seriously change the game for Loop, I think, in comparison to Notion, of course, especially, but it's not the only thing that's missing from Loop. But what with the Power Automate integration, the filtering abilities, and the upcoming database functionality, this is all really starting to come together as a very powerful solution. In my mind, the only thing that's really stopping Loop from taking over the world, if you like, is the lack of an open marketplace for workspaces. Of course, there's a big ecosystem built around Notion. You can go out onto YouTube, you'll find lots of people talking about specific templates for workspaces that they've set up. And you may think that's not really a big issue, but it is a big issue because these Notion workspaces, they represent entire processes and systems that people are set up to run their businesses, and people market these templates, they sell these templates, they give them away for free, and that's part of the attraction of Notion, is that it's easy to import particular systems and workspaces through this template system. Now, Loop does have templates at the moment, but it's restricted in a couple of ways. So templates only apply to individual pages rather than an entire workspace, and it's a closed market, if you like. It's only templates that Microsoft is offering. There are no third-party templates available or can be added at this stage. But if Microsoft can change that to make it a workplace template and an open marketplace, then I think there's really no stopping Loop from being a major challenger to Notion. Probably, as you already know, Windows Server 2025 is just around the corner. I expect it's likely that Microsoft will announce its availability around the time of Ignite, which should be in November this year. But Microsoft has been busy listing which features are going to be removed and deprecated from the new version of Windows Server. And this week they announced that, wait for it, Windows Server Update Services is being deprecated. Now, what does that mean exactly? Deprecation, at least in the eyes of Microsoft, means essentially essentially that they will not be adding any new features to the product. It will be supported going forwards. They're still going to maintain it, but there's no development of this product going forwards. So that doesn't mean, at least at this point, that it's suddenly going to stop working. Microsoft has promised that they'll still be delivering updates through the channel to this feature, so you don't need to worry right this moment if you're using it for patching in your environment. But Microsoft is encouraging that organizations consider moving to another solution. Of course, they're suggesting that you should consider using Microsoft Intune, which is their MDM solution for the cloud, and moving all of your updates into a cloud-based solution. Now, there's been a big fuss, of course, amongst system administrators about this news this week. Many sites rely on this technology to update their servers and endpoints. Some people have been saying that, well, okay, Intune is much more complicated to deploy, more difficult to manage, and that Windows Server Update Services has some specific features that allow it to be used in scenarios where, for instance, you might need to update servers or devices that aren't connected to the internet. It's really useful for that. So first of all, I'd say, well, Windows Server Update Services, I mean, it's clear that Microsoft hasn't really been investing in that technology for many years. So I wasn't expecting this to come right now, this announcement, but on the other hand, it doesn't really come as a big surprise. Is Intune more complicated to deploy and manage? You know, I would debate that. I'd love if you let me know what you think in the comments below about it, but I don't think that Intune is more complex to deploy or more difficult to maintain. At least the last time I looked at installing Windows Server Update Services, it's quite a complex process that you have to go through, especially if you've got several of these services distributed around a geographical network over a very wide area. I don't think that this thing is necessarily easy to install, maintain, and deploy. So I'm not sure that it's really such a big leap to imagine that you might move over to a cloud service, especially in today's situation where you have many people working remotely from lots of different locations. Something like what Microsoft offers with this feature is really a product from the past. Not to say that it doesn't still have its uses today, but if you have one of those specific scenarios that you need to address, then of course there are third-party patching solutions that you could use instead. As far as I know, unless something has changed, Windows Server Update Service is also the updating technology that Configuration Manager uses. So it's interesting to see what will happen with that going forwards, because I assume that at some point Microsoft will stop supporting Windows Server Update Services, and then what is Configuration Manager going to use as its engine for providing OS and software updates? Unless that's something that's already changed, but I don't believe so. Let me know in the comments below as well if you're using Configuration Manager and if you have any plans to move away from that technology. So Microsoft has come up with a new app called Microsoft Places, and it was first announced back in October 2022 at its Ignite conference. It went into private preview, and this week Microsoft has announced that finally it's now available in public preview for everybody to try. So the app is designed to help hybrid teams improve coordination and productivity. Now, in the words of Microsoft, they're saying that it's designed to redefine the boundaries between remote and in-office tasks, and that the app is a testament to Microsoft's commitment to pioneering a dynamic and adaptable work environment. Now, in the press release, Jared Spataro, who's corporate vice president for AI at work at Microsoft, said that AI innovation is already improving how you work, and that improving where you work is the next big opportunity. And that's where the Microsoft Places app fits into the landscape. So not only are we getting this new app called Places, but all of these features and functionalities are going to be surfaced through the Microsoft 365 app ecosystem, of course, including Outlook and Teams. So let's just run through some of the new features that are coming along with Places. So first of all, we have location plans, and this is going to allow employees to share their proposed plans of where they're meeting and what they're going to do, but of course the key is where here. And you'll be able to see who else will be attending the meeting in person. Now that ties in with a new hybrid RSVP functionality. When you RSVP to a meeting, you'll actually be able to specify now whether you're going to attend that meeting in person or remotely. Peak cards are coming to the Outlook calendar, so you'll be able to see who is going to be attending a meeting in the office, and you'll get notifications to book space on office days. The presence signal is also going to be expanded across the Microsoft 365 app ecosystem to show whether you're in an office and which office that you're actually located in. And you'll be able to send out specific in-person meeting invites, so you can actually signal your intention to get people together physically and to have a meeting. Now, while all of that may seem relatively basic and just minor upgrades to the Microsoft 365 apps, there's actually a lot of really cool stuff going on behind the scenes with this application and these changes that I think are really going to make this a great change. Now, one of the things that managers are going to be able to do is specify specific days where they want their team to be physically located together, or as many of them as possible located together in an office, and you'll be able to then see that on your calendar and arrange the necessary spaces to make sure that happens effectively. Now, Microsoft says that managers will be able to say what the priorities for those meetings should be, and that in itself will help to try and bring people together if they can see what the purpose of coming to the office actually is. Now, we talked a little bit about the spaces in which these meetings happen, and the Places Finder in Outlook will actually show a layout image of the room and all the equipment available there, so you can actually make sure the space that you're planning to book has the facilities that you need, and that you'll be able to connect to the people that aren't able to attend physically. Now, while it's not enabled at the moment, later in the year Microsoft is going to be integrating Copilot with the Places functionality, and Copilot will actually be able to go out and find a space for you that it believes is suitable for a particular meeting, so just taking out a lot of that manual grunt work. But one of the great things that the IT team is going to be able to provide people who are organizing these spaces and the equipment in them, because of the better integrated check-in functionality and desk pools, it's going to be able to provide information about how the resources are actually used in practice, and be able to provide that information so that they can make sure that you have the right spaces available with the right equipment. And IT will be able to set policies that automatically releases rooms that have been booked but where nobody has turned up for some reason, so of course releasing those resources for other people to use. Now, at the moment, in order to enable this feature, you're going to need to do that using PowerShell 7 and the Places module, so you'll need to do that with your IT department, get them to enable it. There are some features that are only available at the moment if you opt into them. So as far as I can work out, Places is available in public preview for everybody, but there are some specific features that you will need to opt into if you want to have access to them right at this moment in time. And it's those features that Microsoft is saying, well, if you do opt in to enable them, they're recommending that you only do it at this stage in a test tenant. You can also control access to these Places features by security group. So if you, for instance, only want to allow testing with a certain group of people at the moment, the IT department can define those people. You're probably aware that Teams isn't a unique idea. Slack first had this market cornered many years before Teams even existed. But Slack is something that was developed essentially by geeks for geeks. It didn't have the really simple UI and intuitive use that Microsoft is famous for building into its products. Then Teams came along, and especially driven by the pandemic, usage of Teams really overtook Slack by a long way, and now it's the most used enterprise collaboration and messaging platform in the world. Slack seemed to recognize that it could be a little bit easier to use, and earlier this year it had a bit of a makeover, making it more Teams-like. But this week Microsoft announced that they're also bringing a UI makeover to Teams, and they're going to make it more Slack-like. So let's have a look at what Microsoft announced and what changes are coming. Now, while this might not seem like the biggest change that's come into Teams, it is by a long way the most important in my mind. Microsoft announced this week that it's bringing Teams channels and chats into a simplified, combined view. So you won't have to do the context switching to switch over to Teams channels and then back again to chats, and vice versa, like you have to do at the moment. In the new simplified view that Microsoft is adding to Teams, users will be able to add custom sections so they can organize chats and channels however they like, and there'll be a new favorite section which basically consolidates all your pinned messages into a single place. With the custom sections, you'll be able to organize conversations into projects or topics, just to organize them in any way that really makes sense for you. Microsoft is also adding a new mentions view to Teams, so you'll be able to see all the places that you're mentioned in conversations across Teams, messages and chats in a single pane of glass, and you'll even be able to respond to any of those messages in the side pane. There are also new filters coming to chats and channels that will help you sort messages by criteria like unread messages, for instance. This isn't to replace what Copilot does by looking for messages in chat and all of that. Of course, Copilot, if you have a subscription for that, will still exist, but you'll now have these new features which bring a way for people who don't have Copilot to sort through their messages more easily. So if you haven't seen the new Outlook for Windows application, it essentially looks like Outlook.com or Outlook for Microsoft 365 in the web. So Microsoft is trying to make all of these different versions of Outlook work, look and feel more or less the same, so that you've got a very similar user experience. Now, of course, that's where the classic Outlook app really differs at the moment, because it's something from the past, and it doesn't reflect what Microsoft has been doing in the web versions and now the Outlook for Windows app in recent years. So it's designed to kind of bring some kind of unity to all these different versions of Outlook. It's delivered as an MSIX package, so that's the kind of successor to MSI, the MSI packaging file format. Interestingly, Microsoft is saying that the new Outlook for Windows is a native application. Now, maybe that's a little bit of a stretch of that imagination, depending on how you define a native application. Of course, like the big desktop apps like Word, Excel, and I believe Outlook 2, this is not programmed in something like C++ that's considered a native application on Windows, but it uses, much like the new Teams client, the Microsoft Edge Web View 2. So it's kind of based on web technologies, using a component that's built into Windows, and it's actually portable, so it works on a Mac and I think Linux as well, although don't quote me on that. So native, not native, I guess that's up for debate a little bit. Microsoft is saying that it's a native application. I know that's important to some people, but what Microsoft is describing, how this integrates with Windows, it uses the native Windows integration component. Now, this is a small component that runs in the background. It's updated weekly, or more or less weekly, using the Office content distribution network, and basically it's a thin kind of server component that sits there running and allows the new Outlook for Windows to integrate with Windows more deeply in a way that a web application might not normally be able to do. So things like file dialogues, getting all those kind of integrated experiences with the Action Center and notifications. That's how Microsoft is able to achieve this. Now, these kind of rapid updates to the native Windows integration component, Microsoft is able to do because it updates that component, which is the very small component sitting and running in the background, but none of the features in Outlook for Windows actually are updated at that point. It doesn't involve updating those features in the application itself, but just in this service component that sits in the background. So if you like, the application itself is the client. This native Windows integration component that sits in the background is the server, and they're loosely based on the same version. So while they may not update at exactly the same time, they shouldn't be a million miles apart from each other in terms of version. Now, Microsoft is saying if you have any problems with the two versions not working together, all you need to do is basically close the Outlook app and reopen it, and it should automatically update so that the version number with the native Windows integration component is more or less the same and works, although I haven't experienced any problems like that. But I guess that might happen if somebody doesn't close the Outlook app for a long period of time. Let me know what you think was the most interesting news story of 2024. I'd love to know what you think in the comments below. I'm going to leave you with another video on the screen now about how Google is asking the US government to break up Microsoft's exclusive deal for hosting services required by OpenAI. But that's it from me this week and this year. I'm wishing you all a very Merry Christmas and a Happy New Year, and I'll see you in 2025.